like to go ahead and get started. I'm Deborah Lustig. I'm the Academic Coordinator for the Center for Research on Social Change, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's talk. And I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for Race and Gender. So before we begin, I'd like to announce our next event. On Wednesday, October 17th, Mobility, Expulsion, and Claims to Home, Migrant Organizing in an Era of Deportation and Dispossession. And this is presented by Monisha Dasgupta. And again, that's Wednesday, October 17th at noon in this room. And we do have some flyers for that out in the lobby. And also, if you're on our email list, you'll get an email about it. And if you're not on our email list, please add your email to our sign-in sheet. And even if you don't want to give your email, it'd be great if you could sign in. That helps us prove to the university that we're doing events that people care about. And also allows us to get reimbursed for our lavish refreshments. So if you could please turn off your cell phones and anything else you have with you that makes noise, that would be appreciated. So today, Professor Bristol will speak for about 45 minutes, and that will be followed by question and answer. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Travis Bristol, Assistant Professor of Education here at Cal. We're happy to have him share his work with us in his very first semester on campus. He is a former high school English teacher in the New York City Public Schools, a teacher educator with the Boston Teacher Residency Program, a World Bank consultant, and most recently a Peter Paul Assistant Professor at Boston University. He received his PhD in Education Policy at Columbia University. He has received awards from the National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the American Educational Research Association. In 2016, the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education selected Professor Bristol for its inaugural Teacher Diversity Research Award. His publications include articles in Gender and Education, Urban Review, and Urban Education, among other journals. Please join me in welcoming Professor Travis Bristol.
So good afternoon. Good to see some familiar faces in the audience. Thank you, Deborah, for that introduction. I've been here for about 2 months, so I got a little bit of a walking tour. The Ed School, which is a beautiful Ed School, I encourage you all to come visit. It's a bit of ways from here, so I got to see a bit of Cal, and I rarely ever leave where I am. Today's talk is titled Moving Beyond Recruitment, Supporting and Retaining Black Male Teachers. I mentioned to CB that I am a teacher by training, and so it's going to be very hard to stand here. I'll do my best, but I will use the space provided. But I'll do my best, CB. And one of the reasons why I've sort of framed this talk as sort of suggesting that we need to move beyond recruitment, there's lots in the media. There's so much attention to teacher diversity. Teacher diversity matters, and we see a growing number of teacher recruitment efforts, ethno-racial diversity efforts. But one of the things that I want to lift up, and that I think that you might find during the course of this talk, is that if we don't pay attention to retention and support, much of these efforts will be for naught, right? And so we are spending a great deal of time and energy and resources into recruitment, but we're failing to pay attention to retention and support for the very groups of people that we want to come and teach in our schools. So I'll first talk briefly, I'll share some of my own research agenda, how I come to this work, the challenge as I see it, that there continues to be this ethno-racial mismatch between teachers and students in U.S. public schools. I'll talk about what I termed sort of added value for students of color taught by a teacher of color. Those of you who might remember the days of No Child Left Behind, there was a great deal of work around value added. Here I'll talk a little bit about the added value for students of color when taught by a teacher of color. Then I'll talk a bit about why this matters, and one of the primary reasons why it matters is because teachers of color are leaving at a higher rate than their peers. All these inputs to get these individuals into the profession, but they're leaving at a higher rate because we're failing to pay attention to retention and support. I'll share some review of the literature, how I sort of think about some of these ideas through theory, my data, findings and implications, and I'll share some current work. So my research is sort of focused on these sort of three interrelated strands. I think about the school-based experiences of teachers of color, and this study was on male teachers of color. Particularly, I also think about national, state, and local education policies that both support and take away from, enable and constrain the workplace experiences and retention for teachers of color. And then I think also about the intersection of race and gender in schools. And much of the peer-reviewed work to date, in many ways, builds off of these sort of three research areas. And in particular, I situate my work at the sort of intersection of research, practice, and policy. I believe that the role of doing research is to actually improve things, to shape research, to use research to sort of shape practice and policy. And so that will also in many ways guide this study and guide this talk. So I'll first talk with you a bit about this study that I did, research study on 27 black male teachers in Boston public schools. Then I'll talk a little bit about how my work in research influenced the design of this PD initiative that has informed several initiatives across the country. Then I'll talk about how my work in practice has also shaped policy at the federal level, and in particular in New York City, and how the shaping of policy has influenced some of my current work, the work that I'm doing in New York City. In 2011, Secretary of Education, then Secretary of Education Arne Duncan goes to Morehouse. Morehouse, as you know, is the nation's only all-male historically black college and university. And at Morehouse, Secretary of Education Duncan launches the department's black male teacher recruitment campaign. He calls it Calling Black Men to the Blackboard. At Morehouse, Secretary of Education Duncan said that it was troubling, right, that we see that there are large numbers of students of color, right, but there are only less than 2% of all the nation's teachers are black men. Now, one of the reasons why Secretary of Education Arne Duncan said that this was troubling, because there are more students of color, about 50.3%. These data come from, I think, 2014, so that number has probably increased. So there are more students of color, right, in U.S. public schools than there are white students, and yet about 82% of the teacher workforce remains white, right? So there is this substantive gap between white teachers and teachers of color and their peers in U.S. public schools, and students in particular. And of course, these data are federal or national data, and so there is some difference across states. So for example, or actually I should say in particular, about 1.9% of U.S. public school teachers are black men, about 2% are Latinx men, right? Of course, there are sort of differences. In California, there are larger numbers of Latinx teachers, but yet we still see this sort of ethno-racial gap, right, between the percentage of 66% of all teachers are white and about 75% of students in California public schools are of color. So there is this gap. In 2016, I wrote an op-ed in Washington Post talking about the troubling shortage of Latino and black teachers and what to sort of do about it. And behind the sort of veil of anonymity in the comment section, right, people share how they truly feel, right?
Right, they do.
That is true, right? In very artful and less artful ways. But in many ways, people are asked, like, why does this matter? In some ways, people were getting at this question, right? Like, Secretary of Education Arnie Duncan said that there is this ethno-racial mismatch. I showed you, right, both at the national level and here in California, for example, that there is this mismatch. Like, why does it matter? Someone asked this question, are we in a situation where we need Latino teachers teaching Latino students or white teachers only teaching white students? So I don't know what the protocol is here. I've only been here for a month and a half. So I'm going to ask you just to turn to the person next to you, right, and just grapple with this question, right? Like, why does this matter? Are we in a situation, right, when we talk about this ethno-racial mismatch, that we're suggesting that we need Latinx teachers teaching Latinx students, black teachers teaching black students, white teachers teaching white students? Why does this matter? So the person next to you, right, just grapple with this question, then we'll come back, okay? All right, so I'm curious, what do people say? Are we in a situation where we're saying we need Latino teachers only teaching Latino students, black teachers teaching black students? What do people say? So David, you were.
I get to get in trouble again?
You were sharing something that I often hear when I talk to primarily white policymakers and white teachers. And do you mind sort of sharing
Okay,
that?
so I was thinking about my past. Actually, I met up with an old girlfriend, so then you start talking to them about what did you do and what did you do. And I started thinking, I'd done all this research in San Francisco when I was a graduate student. You know, I passed my exams, but I hadn't done my dissertation. And at that time, I ended up working for a black research and planning firm. And partly because of the skill and aggressive character of my boss, we got a lot of these small contracts to do research. So I ended up being exposed to all kinds of research that I really wasn't particularly skilled to perform. And so in effect, I was the beneficiary of affirmative action. It just passed through the minority firm to me, so that my whole experience was molded. Oh, that question. Okay, that one. So, sorry, got stuck in my past. Okay, both are true. That people of same group tend to have shared background, so that it does work better. On the other hand, shared background and identity. On the other hand, you don't want to get into the point where you say you have to be matched, and you have to, whites have to be next to whites, blacks have to be black next to blacks to learn.
Because you could lose your job.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, there is, in many ways, there is this, that one way of thinking about, if you think about this sort of some sort of zero-sum game, right, is to sort of say that to have more of this particular subgroup means to have less, right? So having more teachers of color means that might mean that we might need to have less white teachers. What else did people say? So I want to just raise it up because I think that could be, and it is a valid concern. I'm curious, what else did people say, or might someone want to respond to that? Yes, and what's your name?
Sarah.
Sarah.
I say this as a researcher and a mother of white children. I think that having a diverse teaching force is important for white children as well. The visibility of a diverse set of what are essentially authority figures, particularly for young children, is important, not only because of the sort of matching desire to give children of color role models that look like them, but because we also have a lot of work to do with white children.
Yeah. And when I think about the Obama presidency in particular, and I think about the continued sort of roadblocks that President Obama faced, and the audacity with which someone would yell, "You lie," State of the Union, that for the first time in those white individuals, right, in their lives, that there was a person who was not, subservient to them, but this person was the commander-in-chief. And that created a great deal of cognitive dissonance, because as adults, they've never had to grapple with this idea that there's someone who may not look like me, who does not necessarily conform to the stereotypes presented in front of me, and yet I have to sort of be their superior. And so when we think about this question around teachers of color for whom may be students of color, but also, right, for white children, right? The black line represents white teachers. The blue line represents teachers of color. These data come from the School and Staffing Survey, right, which is a nationally representative survey of teachers. And what we have found, particularly along the last 3 administrations of that survey, is that teachers of color are leaving the profession at a higher rate than their peers. So evidence-based to say that these teachers matter, dollars being spent around recruitment, and yet we are finding that these teachers, the teachers of color, are leaving at a higher rate, thus the need to pay attention to retention and support. In particular, we find that black teachers are leaving at a higher rate than their peers. These data come from a survey looking at 10 years worth of administrative data by the Albert Shanker Institute, a research arm loosely affiliated with the American Federation of Teachers, and they find that black teachers in particular are leaving at a higher rate than their peers, and in particular black male teachers, right, are leaving at a higher rate, black teachers leaving at a higher rate than their peers, leaving at a higher rate than black female teachers. So you might remember at the beginning I talked about that black male teachers represent roughly about 2% of the U.S. teacher workforce. And so a theory of numbers and group composition in many ways becomes a useful framework to sort of think about the school-based experiences for these black male teachers. Rosabeth Moss Kanter sort of used this theory to look at and to examine the experiences of women workers in a male-dominated profession. And so Kanter says, so I'm using this sort of, white feminist framework to sort of think about and examine the experiences of black male teachers. I'm going to hold that up. But what Kanter finds is that workers who are in the numerical majority, based on their sort of social group identity, that they really shape the culture of the organization, right? So Kanter finds that that the men at this firm, because they were in the numerical majority, right, based purely on numbers, that they really shape the culture of that organization. And so Kanter says that workers in the numerical minority, so in this case women, that they exhibit these sort of 3 responses based on their numerical minority status. So by dint of being in the numerical minority, there were these 3 experiences that they all felt, right, based on their being in the minority. First, there was this idea of performance pressure. So in Kanter's study, the women in Kanter's study felt that they constantly felt pressure to perform in ways that the men at their jobs did not feel, right? They need to perform. There was also this sense of boundary heightening. And so the women at Kanter's firm felt that every time they interacted with men, that their interactions were really based on their numerical minority status. They felt this perception that how they interacted with men was primarily based on men seeing them as women. And then Kanter says that these women in her study exhibited this idea of role encapsulation, that all of the tasks that they were assigned were based on perceptions that people had about that group outside of the organization. So in Kanter's study, the women felt that they were constantly being assigned secretarial tasks because outside of the organization, people believe that women should operate as secretaries, right? There's this belief that they're not sort of in charge. And so these 3 organizational responses to being in the numerical minority, I'm suggesting, right, might be a helpful way to think about the experiences of black men who represent less than 2% of the U.S. population, right? And in particular, Kanter says that these experiences happen when individuals are either 1% or 15%, right, of the U.S. work of some organization. Black men being 2%, right, allows us to sort of think about, allows us to use this framework in examining their school-based experiences. Looking at time, I'm not the first person to sort of do research on black male teachers. There's a long list of individuals who've written about the experience of black male teachers. One of the ways that I've tried to sort of think about and add to the growing literature of Black male teachers is to sort of think about what I've now sort of termed or theorized this idea of called loners and groupers, right? And so much of the research, this main raise builds off of Cantor. I'm looking at what does it mean to be the only person, like an N of 1, right? And even if you're still in the numerical minority, how does that experience compare to someone who might be an N of 3 in their organization? A couple of years ago, I surveyed the Black male teachers in Boston Public School. I write about this in Urban Ed. And what I found was that being the only Black male teacher, that people who said that they were the only Black male teacher, they had very distinct experiences compared to Black men who were in schools of 3 or more. So they're all in the numerical minority, but just being in one, they felt very different experiences than being in groups of 3 or more. One survey item, I asked these Black men to talk about if you believed that people feared you because you were Black. And if you were the only Black man in the building, you believed that people feared you, for example, more than if there were many more Black men in that building. So taking up this idea of boundary heightening, performance pressure, and role encapsulation, I'm interested in that, in these experiences, but I'm also interested in thinking about what it means to be one versus slightly more than one, right? And then how those experiences shape one's desire to stay or leave for being either a loner or a grouper. So my research makes several contributions. To date, largest qualitative study on Black male teachers. Also, the sample of thinking about one versus many more allows me to explore the differential effect of the school organizational context for Black men. In policy, I'll share a bit that it aided in the development of teacher policies, state, local, and nationally, to really sort of move the conversation beyond recruitment to sort of think about support and retention. And you'll see some of that from the findings. And my work in practice has helped to this term that I've coined, differentiating professional development to support male teachers of color. Those of you who work in schools and classrooms, right, know that we spent a great deal of time differentiating support for students based on their social location. So we use the term culturally responsive teaching, culturally relevant pedagogy. So we have spent time thinking about how we differentiate learning for the students, but we've spent very little time thinking about how we differentiate learning for the adults, right, based on their social location. And so this term I've coined, differentiated professional development, is another contribution in terms of practice. I'm going to maybe skip through some of the methods. They are there, and I've written about them quite extensively. But I want to get to the findings. I am a phenomenologist specifically. Let me just get to. So the study took place in Boston. I conducted 2 rounds of interviews, and I interviewed 27 Black male teachers across 14 different schools. Right, 7 schools had 1 Black male teacher. Right, and then 7 schools had 3 or more. Right, that allows me to do the comparison between the loners and the groupers. In total, I conducted 51 interviews, each for about an hour. Now, not only were the experiences of being the only Black man, being one versus being more than one, not only were their experiences different, but what was also interesting was that the kinds of schools they were teaching in were different. Right? And so if you were the only Black man, this was true in this study, and this is actually true because Boston gave me the data for all Black men in the district. If you were the only Black male teacher in your building, your school tended to be higher performing. The school was more likely to be led by a white principal. So you'll see that there are pilot, right? These schools had a great deal of autonomy around hiring. Pilot schools, so these schools were making strategic decisions about who they should hire and who they shouldn't hire. These schools were higher performing. They had more white teachers, more white students, more likely to be led by a white principal. It was also true that schools that had 3 or more, these are where there were grouper teachers, those schools tended to be the schools that were turnaround schools. So these were schools that had been historically struggling, that were failing. one of the things that I used a purposive sample, and as I began to collect data, I realized that that many of my schools were schools that were historically failing. And so one school, so I chose the school Crispus Attucks because it was not a turnaround school. And then during the course of the interview, the school became a school that was going to be turned around, right? So these were schools. So the black men in this district appeared to be concentrated right in the most challenging schools. So principals may have been using these black male teachers for various reasons, right, and seeking them out. So I'll just skip all these things because. So let me just quickly get to some of the findings. So the first question, as it related to performance pressure, boundary heightening, and role encapsulation. One of Cantor's findings was that this pressure to perform came from inside of the organization. So that the women in her study felt this pressure to perform because other people made them sort of the men in her in Indesca, her organization, sort of made them feel this pressure to perform. In my study, I found that the black males said that the pressure to perform came from outside of the organization. So there claimed to be these sort of societal expectations, right? That black male teachers or black teachers, that their jobs were to be of service. Many of them talked about being called, right, to do this work, sort of invoking the sort of spiritual element. There was also one extension to the research literature on school organizational context as it relates to performance pressure is this idea of job crafting. So Resnetsky and Dutton coined this term job crafting, and what they say is that people find ways to make work more meaningful to them that in many ways sits outside of the tasks that they have to do every day. So there are work things that we find meaningless, or the monotonous parts of our job. We do them, but in order to actually engage in our work, we actually find new ways, new tasks. We job craft, right? New ways to make our work much more meaningful. And one of the things that I found in the study was that if you were the only black male teacher, you had less success engaging in job crafting. And if there were many more black male teachers in your school, you had greater success, right, in engaging in job crafting and finding your work more meaningful. One example of this is that the black men of one school where there were many more black male teachers, they were troubled that there was a great deal of suspension, that the black students at their schools were being suspended at a higher rate than their peers. And so these black male teachers on their own created what they called like a black caucus, where they got together to brainstorm ways to improve the school outcomes for black students. This was not something assigned to them by their principal, but in many ways they tried to find alternative ways to make their work more meaningful, right? And these men talked about engaging in this act of job crafting by creating this caucus. Groupers were able to engage in job crafting, loners were less able to do so. One example of this, around how loners were unable to do so, came during the interviewing process. So Josiah Washington seemed to be troubled that he was the only male teacher and the only teacher of color in his school, and so he joined the hiring committee to try to get more people of color and men. So he says, I was the only man of color. I wanted to see if there was a way to have more males, whether they be of color or not. We basically have a K-8 model where students very rarely have a male teacher. And so he talked about, actually, he had just moved to the school, and he talked about how he encouraged people from his previous school, people that he had seen teach, who were good teachers in his mind, to actually apply for a job at his school. These people come interview, and lo and behold, his colleagues, white women, talk about how these individuals were not a good fit, right, for his school. And so he says, after we finished doing all of the hiring, and so he volunteered to join the hiring committee, right? So he tries to make his work more meaningful by volunteering for this task, thus job crafting. And because my claim is that because he's in the numerical minority, or because he is a loner in particular, right, he's less able to engage in job crafting, right, because his voice and the kinds of people he wanted at school, those were not heard. So after we finished doing all the hiring, I felt as though my opinion wasn't garnered because we ended up having all females and my push was for males. I'll talk quickly about this idea of boundary heightening. The black men in this study talked about how they believe that their colleagues saw them as being intellectually inferior. So these are teachers, right, who, many of whom probably voted for Hillary Clinton as opposed to Donald Trump, or in this case, right, would have voted for a Democrat. These are, people who would see themselves as being progressive and liberal, and yet these men believe that their colleagues constantly saw them as being intellectually inferior. And much of these perceptions happened when these black men were talking about ways to enact, or providing suggestions to their colleagues about how to enact culturally responsive pedagogy, when they would share with their colleagues how to move away from harsh disciplinary practices and use restorative justice practices, right? So they're sharing these ideas with their colleagues, and their colleagues would dismiss them. Dennis Sangister says they don't respect my professional opinion. Is it because I'm black? Even now, it still bugs me. If I'm saying it, are you not hearing me? It really messes with me sometimes. It makes you feel inadequate. Like, am I saying something that's crazy? I've been educated. I have a master's. I pass all these MTELs, which is the state teacher exam, just like everyone else. It's frustrating, And finally, as it relates to role encapsulation, these black men talked about, they constantly believed that their colleagues saw them not as teachers first, but as sort of disciplinarians, police officers, and teachers second. And so this came in the form of grading papers, teaching, eating lunch, that their colleagues would bring quote-unquote misbehaving students, often boys, right, to their classrooms. And so you can imagine how having to spend one's attention solely or primarily on attending to everyone else's problems, how that takes away from one's capacity, right, to create cognitively demanding lessons for students, so how to be responsive to the curricular work. Because when principals come into the room, they're not assessing you on how many boys you have in the back of your classroom, right? They're assessing you on creating curricular work that is demanding. Jermaine Carter says, I can see that most people would feel enthused that they're helping out their colleagues, taking care of these misbehaving students. Like, they pick me because they respect me. But it's also becoming a burden now because I have other things to do. I have to plan. I have to plan for my kids to be on a specific track, plan my scope and sequence, correct papers, just the regular things that teachers do. I want to maybe shift quickly to this last research question, because I've spent some time talking about some of the supports and how the conditions in schools make it challenging for these black men to do their work. But I also want to talk about retention and why I think we see this exodus. When I loop back with participants, so I interviewed them for a year, and I asked them whether they were going to stay or leave. And then I looped back with them the fall to actually see if they stayed or if they left. I interviewed, as I said, 27 teachers, 7 men who are the only black men in their building. And even though these men talked about having really sort of challenging experiences in their schools, right? These men faced larger degrees of microaggression when compared to their colleagues. They all stayed at their schools. They returned to their schools the next year. And the primary reason why they returned to their schools is because they said the working conditions were better. So they were aware that there were schools, that there were struggling schools, right? They were aware that racism existed because they were black men in America. But at least they could teach. At least their teaching, right, wasn't policed, and students were not policed. One example of this is Willie Achebe. He says, I taught 90 kids when I was teaching at my first school, at my first 2 schools. And I had so much grading to do. Right now I teach only about 50 kids. We call our school the Country Club. Many of the teachers who are here have worked elsewhere. They've had heavy workloads. I spent the entire summer developing a 12th grade curriculum. Right? And so these teachers talked about, at least they had the capacity, the flexibility, right, to think about how to teach and what to teach. They were also, teaching at pilot schools. These schools had much more autonomy around how students learned, which students they selected, which students they hired. So loners, right, had much more flexibility, and the working conditions in their schools were such that they decided to stay. When I look back with the groupers, these were schools with 3 or more black male teachers. These men talked about how, yes, they may have had more camaraderie with the other black teachers in their school, but the working conditions in those schools, right, were much more challenging. That the administrative leadership, right, in their schools was sort of much more challenging. One example of this is from Dante Little. Mr. Little talks about his students are taking the state standardized exam, and during the administration of the exam, or before the exam, he collects all the cell phones. The assistant principal, who is a black woman, right, comes to his class to see if the cell phones have been collected. She says, here are the 3 cell phones. She says, you have more than 3 students. Where are the rest of the cell phones? Students are working on the exam. And during the exam, she stops students from taking the exam and begins to frisk, right? Begins to check their backpacks to see if indeed all of the cell phones had been collected. This is during a state exam. Dante Little says, even if you're trying to do the right thing, you're going to be harassed and treated like a criminal for no reason. And I'm just done with it. This isn't a prison. We can't run it like it's a prison. We can't treat our kids like they're criminals, especially when they're not doing anything wrong. It creates tension. No one wants to be here. I'm just done with it. Personally, I'm over with it, right? And so Dante leaves, and the reason that many of the black men in the study said that they left were primarily because of these challenging working conditions, where not only their practice, right, how they should teach and how they should interact with students were policed, right, by school administrators, but also students themselves were policed. So what are the implications for practice? Tony Bright says that when we grow the people, that we improve organizations when we improve both the people and the organization. So I'm gonna sort of talk about how my work has both focused on the people piece, and that is thinking about the social and emotional challenges that these men have faced, right? And the limited opportunity that these men have said that they've had to experience or to grow their own practice. I talked about that in terms of the support. I'm going to talk about how I've attended to the people piece, and that is by thinking about this idea of differentiating support for male teachers of color. At the time I was collecting these data, I was also working in a teacher prep program, and so I created this professional development opportunity for male teachers of color. The mission was to sort of talk about and to focus on the sort of social and emotional support. The group met on Fridays from 5 to 7. The first half focused on the social and emotional support. The second half focused on what my colleague Judith Warren Little talks about, a community of practice, right? So I'm just going to play a quick video here. So here you see these black men talking about, this is a black male teacher. There are teachers from other ethno-racial groups here. We hear them talking about trying to grapple with the role of a male teacher of color in educating boys of color. I often give the example, I did my teacher prep work at a school that is a rival of the school, right, which I've known not to sort of name openly. But I think I received fantastic teacher preparation, right? I had 2 courses with Linda Darling-Hammond, who is one of the preeminent scholars, education researchers. I had a class, I had 2 classes, 2 content classes with Pam Grossman, who was a dean at UPenn. So the people who taught, the teachers were like the top folks in the field. And yet there were ways that my preparation did not prepare me to become a teacher. One example I give is that during what you all on this coast term Indigenous Peoples Day, right? In New York we called it Columbus Day. When I came back to school on the Tuesday, I saw that my roster had shifted, right? That there were many more boys, young men in my class. And there was nothing in my preparation that helped me understand what to do with these influx of boys. And so here you have these men, right, in this safe space saying, well, what's our role, right? Because there's nothing that's been a part of the preparation that has helped these men understand what to do with all these boys of color. So here you see, I'll play a video and you'll hear them talking about this idea of what's their role. quickly, what's the term, what does swag mean?
It's the stuff you get.
It's the stuff you get. I love asking this question because value is funds of knowledge, right? It is, in many ways, the stuff that you get. But what else is it? Who said that? Yeah, it's being cool, right? I mean, in sort of in an urban quote unquote context, right? Swag is not the stuff that you get, but if you were to ask this that's a whole another talk, right? That depending on the question that you ask and the cultural experiences you have influences how you answer the question. That's maybe we'll invite me to do that talk another time. But in this case, right, you'll hear this teacher talking about how he uses this term swag, so in his to be cool, and he appropriates it to have this sort of content association where swag means students who achieve great gains, right? So he uses this term that means cool outside of the classroom, and so here you'll hear these men talking. He's talking about how he uses this term swag in his classroom.
Align with sort of my version of cool, which is academically cool, is we have something, especially in my classroom, called math swag. So it's like, swag is actually an acronym standing for students who achieve great gains. So we talk about what math swag means and how it means like mathematical confidence. But in students' context, it's something different.
So this idea of taking students to sort of lived experiences and making a bridge into the classroom, it's not, right? We're not making this up, right? This is what we expect people to do. But in this space where we all see each other, where we see each other and people see us as being practitioners, as being teachers, right? I can actually share my ideas freely. I can have some of these experiences normalized in this space. And so when I return to my school site and people do not necessarily see me as being a practitioner, as someone who's knowledgeable about teaching and learning, right? I'll know that across the city, people are using these terms, these ways to engage students, and that supports my engagement with the school and with teaching. So I started this sort of pilot initiative in 2013 when I was working at the Boston Teacher Residency Program. The school district took up this idea. It became an initiative throughout the city. Secretary King visited with the group. At the time, Secretary King was sort of moving beyond recruitment. So Duncan talked about recruitment when King assumed became Secretary of Education. He talked a lot about the school-based experiences, and so I had presented some of my work at a convening at the department. And at the time, President Obama had signed ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. And while the department was sort of writing the regs for ESSA, I shared with them that, and these are in the Title II regs, that we should begin, given our push to diversify the workforce, that we should begin to sort of think about, you've heard me talk about this idea of differentiated support for all teachers, right? And so there is license that states now have to sort of do this kind of work. There are many districts and initiatives, maybe during Q&A, Misha from the Black Teacher Project, who's over there, or maybe you all might find her right and talk. But there are many of such initiatives where people are really thinking about attending to some of the school-based experiences, providing support for teachers of color. That's happening around the country, some as close as the city next to us. Some of this work has influenced my current work in New York City. So 3 years ago, Mayor Michael de Blasio launched this initiative called NYC Men Teach to recruit 1,000 men of color. They had the department had seen some of my work in New York because I found that it was important to also think about support. I work with the city to sort of add this element of support. And so for the past 2 years, I've been studying NYC Men Teach. We can maybe talk. I want to leave some Q&A, some time for that. And in a couple of weeks, I'll find out if this project is funded. This is in Compton. So Compton is also particularly interested in thinking about the kinds of supports that male teachers of color might need and how you mentor them. And so some of the work that I did in Boston, as you'll see, has influenced some of the work in New York and some of potentially my future work. I think that puts me at 1. So I'm going to stop and try my best to answer your questions.
people can just think about answering these questions.
Lots of questions. Thank you for the talk.
Wait, what's your name?
Laura.
Laura.
I guess one of my kind of initial questions is just about the focus on Black male teachers and where is it because of that you saw a lot of retention or like a lack of retention in particular for those groups, and what, because I felt like a lot of the things you describe apply to Black female teachers or Latino female and male teachers, and I just was curious about that.
Yeah. So, thank you. And I have heard that, right? That people have said, these things also apply to Black female teachers. You might remember that when I started, I talked about this. I was particularly interested in this notion, right? So when Secretary of Education Arne Duncan said that we needed to call Black men to the Blackboard, right? There seemed to be a great deal of focus on recruiting individuals from this group or this sort of subset of teachers because of this belief that they might somehow increase the outcomes of Black boys. And so I wanted to sort of think about, well, beyond recruitment, right? How is this particular group experiencing schools, and how are their experiences making them stay or leave? And so, my unit of analysis here was clearly on Black male teachers, and in future work, I think it's important to sort of think about similarities and differences. I mean, the gendered work, I think the gendered nature of this work is that, I can't remember her name, she writes about this idea of Black mothering, right? I mean, in many ways that these men were not, these men were seen as being like Black, they were, presented or situated, right, as Black fathers, because of this belief that Black boys don't have Black fathers at home, right? And so that, like, tough love became the sort of gendered aspect of this work. But I think to your point, right, that there are clearly some similarities between Black female teachers and Black male teachers. But my unit of analysis focused on Black male teachers because it stemmed from grappling with this idea of, beside calling them, how can we support and retain them? Jason.
So also a lot of questions, but I'll follow with you. But where do you find your work, because you're way more qualitative than I am, that speaks to why? What is it about when Black men succeed with reaching and improving the outcomes of their Black students or all of their students? Is it that they provide a context where those students can feel comfortable to learn? Is it that is it a linguistic thing?
Yep.
Is it an explicit thing where they're telling they're calling them kings, for example, like they do here in Oakland? Is it just, what are just some of the things you found? Because as you know, it's rare to find a sample of enough Black teachers, period, in a given school.
Yeah. I write about this. One of the things that these Black men say is that that people at their school think that they're doing something that's magical, and it's not. What they're doing is I guess it's a socio-emotional piece. So they're asking them, how is your grandmother? Did you eat breakfast? How are you doing? Right? And so it's building some of those relationships. And their colleagues think it's just because that they're responding to them just because they're Black men. And these Black men are saying, I'm actually attending to some of their social and emotional needs. And that allows me to redirect their misbehavior or their perceived misbehavior. Right? And so I think that there are some implications. I think people are also, so what are the implications for other teachers or white teachers, right? Is a question that, again, people have been pulling me in that direction. I think it's also thinking about how do you teach teachers to love people? Love becomes a very, it's a word that I've sort of strayed away from as a social scientist, right? It's not, but there is this sense that these students believe that their teachers actually loved them, and there were ways that they expressed that through asking them about, how's your grandmother, what did you eat? And because these teachers demonstrated love, right, then that sort of built their relationship, and the white teachers believe that they just had to on average, right, had to respond to the discipline or the content without the heart. There was much of the head and very little of the heart.
So there's,
Sorry, what was your name?
oh, Frank.
Frank.
So when you first put up the chart that showed 2% of the teachers were black men, I thought, wow, that's, and the population of students is much more skewed. But when I got to thinking about it, it's not that there's not that many black teachers, it's that there's a lot of black students. So if you were in California and we had 2 or 3% black male teachers, that would be just about our expectation. It's a 5% male, a black population, and half of them are women. And so we'd expect about 2.5% of teachers to be black men. And so, but the population of students in public schools is heavily skewed towards black and Latino because the white students all leave the public schools. So we might have to kind of think about why we're thinking that black male teachers are underrepresented here. They're underrepresented relative to the students, but maybe not to the population.
I think it begs the question around why the population, is not reflected in public schools, right?
Yeah.
So people are clearly choosing or opting out of public education. And so I'm particularly thinking about the population of students in schools, right?
Yeah.
And so, and I also think that so I think it varies by state. So here in the state of California, right, I think that it might be interesting to think about why we don't see a larger number of Latinx teachers, right, for example, right, that the percentage of Latinx teachers do not at all reflect the percentage of Latinx students across the state. I think it might be also, so these are state level data. When we go looking at districts, right, we might find that there might be some districts probably across the state where there are larger concentrations and fewer concentrations of a particular subgroup, right? And I think it might be important to ask ourselves why that is as well, right? So these are state level data, and I think that the numbers might look different in Oakland versus Palo Alto, for example, right? But I think we should also, as we talked about here, right, that on average, I'm saying this having spent some time at Stanford, right, and being in that space, right, that the children, right, in Palo Alto also deserve teachers who might not look like them, because those places are where they're least likely to be concentrated.
I have a question. I love your focus on the organizational context and this idea of the differentiated professional development. I think is really interesting. I'm wondering, have you seen any receptivity to kind of differentiated professional development for administrators? Like, if we're going to change the organizational context, or for white teachers, but not in the sense of for white teachers to teach black kids better, but for white teachers to be better colleagues. I mean, like that whole hiring committee example, for that to change. Yeah. So actually, I was talking to a grad student. Much of my work, so the work, I don't know if this, let's see here. The work in New York, school level conditions, these are some of the findings from my work in New York. All right, so my study in New York, one of the things that I found was that essentially principals are the ones who shape the conditions of schools. And so much of my work has sort of moved to sort of thinking also about teachers, but also about the principals, and to getting a sense of how they are organizing their schools, and then thinking about the kinds of supports that they need. So one of the things that I'm doing in New York, or that I have suggested to the department, and that they're beginning to sort of create, right, are these like professional learning sessions for principals. Because oftentimes, I think to your point, the preparation that principals receive, right, it's really focused on like rightfully giving teachers feedback on their practice, but it's less about attending to the people-to-people dynamics in the building, right? So principals aren't aware, right, that asking a black male teacher to stand in front of the building, right, in many ways is an example of role encapsulation, right? But thinking about how you provide the conditions for principals to reflect on some of these practices might be helpful. So in New York, we're really engaging in this work. There's a foundation, the Schussman Foundation,
they sent me a contract, right? That they're also thinking specifically about this idea of supporting principals. So they're going to be thinking about how you support principals of color, because in many ways, and we got this from our New York study. Principals of color really also, they talked about some of the backlash that they received when they were working in where the faculty were mostly white. And so how do you help principals of color negotiate some of those challenges? So yeah, I think there are many implications for the work of principals, and I'm beginning to sort of think about the work of teachers as being connected to principals, because that attends to the organizational dynamics of the building. Sorry, is it
Christine.
Christine.
Yeah. This may have been on one of your slides and got cut off or something. I may have missed it. But I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about this retention problem that you're studying and addressing. And where do these black male teachers go?
Yeah.
Do they go to other schools? Yeah. Or do they drop out of the education profession altogether? And if so, what then becomes their profession?
Yeah. So, great question. So, in this study, what happened on average was that these men were moving from school to school to school. So the turnover rate, so there is this idea of, when we say turnover is a broad category, there's something called movers and leavers, right? So leavers are folks who actually leave the system, movers move from school to school to school. What I found on average was that the loners, the guys who are by themselves, at one point, I think you probably saw that when the guy talked about how at his previous school, right, that they moved from challenging school contexts to school contexts where they were they were like the only one. I mean, we know that teachers of color are on average more committed to working with a particular group of students, and so in urban settings, so they are moving from school to school to school on average, rather than leaving the profession. So they're more likely to be movers than leavers.
Hi.
Hi. Hey, how are you? Good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
You were on a panel with us last week.
I was really struck by the fact that if you had a single black male teacher at a school, that school tended to be better resourced.
Yeah.
Well, I'm inferring, not a turnaround school. And then thinking about the interview practices and the bias that's manifesting there. So in essence, it's these teachers are actually being tracked into lower performing schools or less resourced schools. So like the schools that are set up to fail students are also set up to fail teachers.
So there are lots of associations there. So I first began, so what I did, I'm going to show you what this is. So the district gave me the schools that had 0 black male teachers, 1, 2, or 3, right? And these is the racial principles. So so if the school had 0 black male teachers, the principals were like 50% of those schools were white versus the school that had 3 or more. It's almost sort of flipped, right, in terms of the faculty. I think Diva Pager, the mark of the criminal record, Diva Pager, sociologist, talks about how having a criminal record, that a white man with a criminal record had a higher likelihood of getting a job than a black man with a college degree, right? And so we know that bias happens in various forms during the interviewing process. It was when I looked at, and I haven't written this piece up yet, that the kinds of schools that the men who were the only black men, right, those men on average went to more elite schools. I guess this probably happens here at Berkeley, right? That you're looking for folks who come from different types of institutions to be on the faculty. This is being recorded, isn't it? And I don't have tenure yet, but there is some selection bias, right? That we're particularly interested in certain types of people to work at certain types of schools, and so these schools that on average that were led by white principals more likely have white teachers. That there was a certain type of black man who could fit in these spaces, right? Versus black men who had, and so these men all on average had come from elite schools, less state schools. Versus the black men who were groupers were more likely to come from more elite space, less likely to come from elite spaces. It was also really interesting, this idea, like during the interviewing process, so clearly, the way I'm speaking I was interviewing all the participants. And this was primarily true for the loners. There were oftentimes when the transcriber, so the transcriber is an independent person, I sent out to be transcribed, said that they had it became hard to distinguish, right, the person being interviewed and the person that I was interviewing, because their speech pattern in many ways mirrored my speech pattern. And that seemed to be on average less the case where people on average, right, may have been speaking in or code switching or shifting into various forms of Black vernacular English. And those folks were more likely to be at the grouper schools. Those schools were more likely to have a Black principal. So there are many elements of the interviewing process, right? That this doesn't just happen. It wasn't the focus of this study, right? Because I was really focused on support and retention. But the kinds of Black men who were in different kinds of schools, right, had a lot in some ways to do with background. There were some background characteristics that might have influenced how they entered there. I haven't yet teased this apart, but those are some of my initial thinking.
If I may follow up on that, with the movers and thinking about retention in that way, I don't know how you'd be able to detect this, but did you feel like there was a mental health component such that this may be bad for them as teachers? That they have to keep starting over? Or is it better for them to be in a space where they can feel more comfortable? As we think about hypertension rates overall for Black people due to fear of being a victim of bias, tighter counties with more implicit bias, things like that.
So that wasn't a piece that I didn't explore. I didn't ask people like why they moved from school to school, right? But yeah, I mean, let's collaborate and do that study.
Okay, there.
So, anecdotally around here, and I don't have the hard data, I've got the experiential data. There's these recruitment pushes, but the districts are in a boom-bust state. So they go and recruit, they cooperate with the state institution like Cal State East Bay to make it possible for students to get their credential while they work. And so that program then gets more teachers of color. But then there's a contraction in money. So those students are more likely to be laid off. The other part of it is whether you're a teacher of color or a white teacher, you start at the bottom. So they're going to give you the most problematic tracks. They're going to have you have repeat introduction to math for algebra or algebra in 10th and 11th grade when the people on the math track. And then they're going to criticize you for failing to get good results. And even more, you're collaborating with the backwardness of these students, butting up to them, and you're not controlling I can hear noise in your classroom. You don't have enough control of the environment. Now, part of it is new teachers do have a hard time controlling the environment, but it's this mixture of the funding cycles and the placement cycles work together to create the absence of clear tracks of mobility. So you have your three years in order to become permanent, but in a lot of special programs, you're not on the tenure track. It's very much like being an adjunct person in a university.
So, I mean, I can't speak to maybe the folks from Oakland can talk to the funding piece, because that's not something. Do you want to say anything about it? I can speak to the other piece about where people. I don't know. I don't want to put you on the spot. Maybe we can talk. There's some folks from OUSC here, so you can maybe ask them about the funding piece.
I'm happy to talk about it. I mean, that's fine. We're in a national. I'm Sarah. I have a really amazing role in Oakland Unified, which is to support retention and employee development. And we're in a really extreme teacher shortage. It's really expensive to live in the Bay Area. I was raised in Oakland. My husband is a teacher in Oakland. We won't be able to buy a home in Oakland anytime in the future. So thinking about sustainability and people's livelihoods and what all of the external pressures are is really important to us. But then we don't have enough teachers in any area, not to mention enough teachers of color for students in all schools. So I think that I think it's a really complex question. There is a lot of funding coming in right now to support recruitment, retention, and development of teachers. We have a specific focus on teachers of color in Oakland. And it's like we can't get the money fast enough to develop enough support because the process of becoming a teacher in California is also excruciating. And private and charter sectors don't necessarily always align with the state requirements. So it can be easier to become a teacher in different sectors than it is to become a teacher in the district sector. So we're battling lots of factors, but for sure what you mentioned is true. If you start with an emergency permit, you are a temporary at-will employee. You don't move towards tenure until you are in a program. We have hundreds of people starting without a credential. They're disproportionately teachers of color, and they're disproportionately at-will temporary employees.
And I would say that even if you have, just to your point about first year white teacher, first year, in this case, black male teacher, even if they're starting at the same school, it was the case, at least in this study, that these black men believed that they were being sent the most challenging students, right? And so we're both first year teachers, right, dealing with all of the other organizational challenges and stresses of being a first year teacher. And then all things being equal, the administrators were still sending them the most challenging students and positioning them to be in charge, right, in some out of school or out of classroom responsibilities to attend to the most challenging students, right? And so thus thinking about supports for this subgroup is important, which is sort of different from thinking about the supports for first year white teachers.
So I want to get to those supports and just ask about the Friday 5 to 7, because you have to want to be there Friday 5 to 7. And you talked about the first half of that differentiated professional development being focused on social emotional learning, and then the second being around communities of practice. And I'm just curious if you could tell us a little bit more about the activities, or what did those 2 hours look like? I'm assuming that the swag was part of the second, but if you could give us some examples of the...
So, did they get paid? Did they get a stipend?
No. So these folks were coming voluntarily. They were, so one, these men were part of a teacher prep program. So they were either graduates or in-service or pre-service teachers, right, of this teacher prep program, the Boston Teacher Residency Program, right? But I think that the reason why they came was because they felt like that the district, Boston, that the district wasn't providing this. I mean, people show up to things that they find meaningful. Teachers show up to things that they find meaningful. And these men were committed to being teachers, but there wasn't any space or place that valued their capacity or encouraged their capacity to teach. And so this differentiated opportunity was a very different experience. And so I think that's my sense was that's why they came. So some of the activities, so I write about this, I feel like you've seen I can send you my cap-in piece, but I lay out each of the activities along the socio-emotional and the dilemma of practice. So very much like what happens with the National Writing Project, where people, and also with National Board, the Professional Teaching Standard, where people have to identify something in their own practice that makes you own it, right? So collectively, people had to, one, identify something that they wanted to work on in their own practice and bring it to the group. I also strategically asked other people to facilitate someone else's session, so that made other people accountable, right, to the practice piece. But the group as a collective came up with what they wanted to talk about at the end of one meeting, and then we focused on that during the next meeting. So it was really responsive to what people want to do. Now, a couple of districts, like I've been telling like a couple of school districts have been doing work with them, and like people want a preset thing, right? So Like they want me to come up with the and I'm happy I'm happy to do that, but like, without understanding the context of the place, being responsive to the context of the place, like people don't own it. And so, so I think that's what made this particularly unique. And these other things, I've done some work, anyway, we can talk about that later, but I think that it has to somehow it has to be sort of co-designed with people so it can be responsive to the context of teachers.
Yes, last question, and then we'll have a little time for just informal chatting after we close the formal part.
This is a question, I guess, about your thoughts, since I know your research project doesn't focus on this, but the emphasis on attracting male teachers particularly seems framed around boys of color rather than no one's talking about white boys need white men in the classroom. And obviously the issue of attracting and retaining male teachers has a lot to do with the conditions and salaries that teachers are paid overall, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts about why this intersection of it's particularly important that we have black men teaching black boys, or perhaps the same thing in the Latino community that's framed, that is not ever, I've never seen it framed that way for white boys or Asian boys, for example.
So I do think that it's I'm troubled by that framing, right? Because one, it lets people off the hook. It says that this subgroup is uniquely responsible for working with these with these students, and I know some districts have picked up that idea. But it also there's also a great deal of, it also presupposes that these men want to uniquely work with this population, that they themselves, right? A colleague of mine, Ed Brockenbrough, talks about this idea of, he says, I don't want to be your daddy, right? Like, and so some of these men are positioned through these recruitment efforts around this. One of the things that New York City has done, right, is that they have reframed the idea of having more men of color as not only serving or working with boys of color, but it's also helping like girls of color, right? They're white teachers, right? To understand how you navigate unfamiliar cultural terrain, right? And so I think that once we begin to have a more expansive view around, I guess, added value for teachers of color, not only for the children but for their peers, other teachers, and for the system, right? Then I think we begin to get white individuals on board who see this as, to David's point, right, a way to get them out, right? But this somehow can benefit the entire system. I think once you make someone uniquely responsible for one subgroup, right, then it becomes easy to dismiss this as only being uniquely responsible for one subgroup that historically I haven't cared about. So why then should I care about this initiative?
Okay, I think we'll close there, and if you're available, please stay and chat for a few minutes. We have some refreshments, and let's thank Professor Bristol for his talk.